Hi guys, welcome to Little Wicket Railway. I'm Rob and this is part 2 of Project Pug. In part 1 I fitted a Coreless motor into a 40-year-old Dapol Pug and added a tiny decoder so that it would run on DCC. And if you didn't catch that video, I'll put links up in the corner and in the video description. In this video I'm going to have another go at fitting the Stayalive. My previous attempt didn't work because I had the wrong type of power pack. Then I'm going to design and 3D print a cab interior and see what we can do to repair the damaged areas around the model. Finally, I'm going to see if we can add some weight to the model to give it a bit more pulling power because I had to remove a lot of weight to fit the new motor in. Before we start, please do subscribe to the channel and give the video a like if you're enjoying it. It's totally free for you and greatly appreciated by me because it encourages YouTube to promote the channel. Also, if you'd like more railway content, then I've got a second channel called L&YR2 that hosts all the slightly more unusual stuff, so please feel free to check that out and I'll put a link up here. Right, let's get started by having another go at fitting that power pack. So this is the one I plan to fit, the Train-o-matic 3-wire power pack, and it didn't work with the Butler and decoder. I should have read the decoder manual more carefully. So I ordered an alternative. This is the Lay's DCC Kung Fu Light Stayalive, which is a 2-wire version and should, fingers crossed, be compatible. So I'm going to cut these wires down and get it soldered up to the decoder. So there we are, all connected. Let's see if it actually works this time. I've had the model running on the track for a minute. That should be long enough for the capacitors to charge up. Let's lift it off and see whether it keeps running. So the moment of truth. There we go. Wow, that's actually incredible. I'll have to go back and time this, but that is dead impressive. There we go, finally stopped. So that power pack will be more than sufficient to power this over any dead spots. That's really impressive. So now let's look at the cosmetics of this thing. Starting with the easy stuff, the rear coupler is completely knackered, so that can come off. And I think I'll just replace it with the front coupling for now because that looks to be in decent condition. And if at a later date I decide I need a front coupling, then I'm sure I've got some in the spares box that will fit. Next up, we've got the dumb buffers. So these just look like cubes and they're literally just blocks of wood, I think, that were stuck to the buffer beam. This one's completely missing, it's snapped off. And I don't think these will be too difficult to model, so I'll get these printed out and I will probably remove this one and print a pair so that they look identical. Then the main area that needs work is the cab area, and there's a lot to do here. I need a way to cover up these holes that the screws and wires used to pass through in the floor. I need to design an interior with a firebox and some controls and that sort of thing. And I think there's meant to be a brake handle that comes up here. So I'll need to model that as well. And then on the actual clip-on cab, one of the clips that holds it in place is missing. There's damage to the edges of the roof, pretty much on all sides. There's this large panel here that will need to come off. I can't see that in any of the photos. I don't know why Hornby or Dapol put that in there. And I think this front thing is some sort of valve or whistle. Firstly, it's damaged, but also it's not in the photos that I've got, so it needs to come off. Then I think a whistle is actually needed up here because I can see that in the photos. And then if I'm being really fussy, the lamp brackets don't look great. They're more like steps than brackets. And the windows on the model don't really look like the windows in the photo. The windows look like they should be more flush with narrower frames. So yeah, there's quite a bit to do here. Having seen how much there was to do on the cab, I decided that rather than try and fix the original, it might actually be easier to recreate the cab with all the new features and 3D print it. I use SketchUp to do my 3D modelling because it's free for hobbyists and I find it quite easy to use. I'm not the best at 3D design and I knew I wasn't going to be able to get things perfect. The aim was just to create something that resembled the original enough to be passable at a distance. I started by taking measurements of the original cab and importing photos of the model to get the right shape and size. The cab sits over the boiler, so it was really important to get a snug fit there, and I also wanted to make sure that the curve of the roof was as close to the original as possible. I never expect things to be right first time, and it's hard to know how models are going to turn out when they're printed, but to start with I just wanted to get all the key features on there, such as the gap for the boiler, the clips that hold it onto the frame, the lining around the windows, that sort of thing. I decided not to model the handrails in plastic, they'll be too fragile, so I'll fit those separately using wire. This was all designed to be printed on my L&YR Mars 2 Pro resin printer, which can produce small models with excellent detail. And for small models, it's often easier to scale everything up to start with, so for example you could model at 10 times the size and then shrink it back down later for printing. Although if you're going to model this way, you have to consider if things are still going to print well once it's been reduced in size. I wanted the walls of the cab to be 1mm thick on the model to give it enough strength. If that was scaled up to full size though, the walls would be 3 inches thick, which obviously isn't realistic, but those are the kind of compromises you need to make when working on small models. The rivets on the cab were particularly tricky because they had to follow the curve of the roof. I didn't count how many there were on the original, I just went with something that looked sensible. And after I had a cab that looked okay, I started work on the interior. I decided to use the existing screw hole in the chassis that was previously used to secure the motor to hold the interior in place, so I started by creating a countersunk hole for the screw to pass through. On these pugs, the coal was transported in the cab area either side of the firebox, so I modelled those containers with space underneath to put weight in and space on top for some coal to be added later. Thank you to James, Demoy and Callum for sending me photos of the pug interiors and diagrams that I could work off of. I spent a lot of time working on these models, printing versions to see if things fitted and worked, and then doing revisions, but here are the final versions of the models in SketchUp, and this is how they turned out when printing. I used black water washable resin for these, and I've started curing the models in water. It's much quicker to cure in water and seems to give better models overall, but it leaves this light coloured staining on the surface when I dry it with the airbrush. That's not really a problem though, because I need to paint these anyway. Then it was just a case of putting everything together and making sure it all fit. I replaced the silver screw that came with the original model with a more discreet black screw that sits flush with the cab floor, being very careful not to knock any of the more fragile parts of the cab interior when screwing it in. Then when fitting the cab, I was very careful not to bend the clips too much because I know from my test versions that they're very easily broken. Having got a model that looked okay, it was time to address the lack of weight. So we've got the scales here, and let's put the model on and see where we currently are. So that's 38 grams, and that's really not a lot. Some wagons weigh more than that. And the problem with having a light locomotive is that there's less traction for pulling rolling stock. A while ago I did an experiment to see how many coaches different locomotives could pull up gradients, and as part of that I recorded their weights. There was a clear link between weight and pulling power. The lightest loco I tested was the Bachmann Thomas the tank engine, which was 81 grams, so that's 43 grams heavier than my modified Pug, and it could barely get 2 coaches up a 1% gradient. And just for comparison, I've got the original Dapol Pug, which comes in at 100 grams. So I've managed to remove 62 grams by doing my modifications, and we need to get some of that weight back into the model. So I was made aware of this stuff called liquid gravity from Deluxe Materials, which, despite the name, isn't actually a liquid, but loads of really small metal balls. I'm not sure what they're made of, but they're non-toxic, so presumably not lead. Apparently, you pour these into a cavity in your model and then glue them into position. I started by filling up all the compartments that I'd created in the interior, the 2 under the coal bunker and the area behind the firebox door. A top tip if you're going to be using this liquid gravity stuff is to put a tray or something to catch the little balls underneath just in case they fall out, and you'll see that I started doing this later on in the process after learning the hard way that these things can really go everywhere. Deluxe Materials recommend using their Rocket Cyno glue, which is an incredibly strong and fast setting glue. It's great for seeping between the balls as it's really runny, and it sets solid in only a few seconds, but that means you need to be really careful when using it. I would definitely recommend using goggles to protect your eyes, wear old clothes just in case it splashes, and doing this over something you don't really care about because this glue is serious stuff and it does splash and drip, and there's no time to clear it up before it sets. After all this, I put the model back on the scales and was slightly disappointed to see that despite filling all the cab spaces, I'd only managed to add 4 grams. Increasing the weight was going to be quite a challenge, so I set about finding every possible place to put some liquid gravity that wasn't going to interfere with the mechanism or the electrics, and if you search around the model, there are a few places that can be filled. I ideally wanted the weight to be over the driving wheels for maximum effect, but at this point I was just happy to get any additional weight on board. Having filled every available space that could suitably take liquid gravity, I'd only managed to add another 4 grams, bringing the model up to 46 grams in total, still quite a way short of the 100 grams target. At this point, I was thinking that I might have to give up on this project until I discovered tungsten putty. This is actually designed for fishing weights, but it seemed perfect for my requirements. Tungsten is a really dense metal, which is exactly what I needed, and the fact it was a putty meant that I could jam it in places without having to worry about getting it to stay in place. It also wasn't super expensive. I got 30 grams for £12, which came in 2 15-gram tins, and my objective was to cram every last bit of it into the model. I started by pushing it down into the boiler either side of the motor mount. I was also able to get some into the chassis around the pickups and under the base keeper plate. I think this stuff is probably better than liquid gravity because if you need to access the pickups again, for example, then it's not permanently glued in, you just need to pick the putty out. But I suppose only time will tell whether this stuff really is a good choice. It might go rock solid over the years, or it might go liquidy for all I know, so maybe ask me again what I think in a few years' time. Despite my best efforts, I didn't manage to get all the putty into the model, but I did manage to get the model up to 70 grams. That's not great, but there are a few more grams to be gained from adding fake coal, handrails, and maybe a white metal crew. Hopefully that'll be enough for this model to pull 2 or 3 wagons around a brewery, which is all I need it to do. I did also print out some buffers, and here I've just tacked one into place on the front to see what it looks like, but I'm not going to fit buffers in place until they're painted. I think that's a good place to end this video. The Stayalive is working, the cab looks okay, and I've managed to get the weight back up. There's still a fair bit to do in part 3. All the new parts need painting, and I need to fit handrails and cab windows. I'd like to add in some coal and a crew. The model needs renumbering, and I'd like to have a go at giving it a bit of a weather. If you found this video useful, then please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Special thanks to the YouTube members and patrons for your support. Your names are up on the screen now and it is very much appreciated. Thanks for watching, and I'll hopefully see you again soon.